Welcome, everyone, to Inside the Vault. My name is Allison Kraft, and I am the Assistant Curator for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And we are really excited to have you join us this evening for a discussion about 20th century voting rights with Dr. Barbara Perry. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Barbara Perry, the Gerald L. Baliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-chairs the Presidential Oral History Program. She has written and edited a number of books and has served as the lead expert for CNN's documentary, The Kennedys. Dr. Perry, welcome to tonight's program.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison, and everyone at Gilder Lehrman. And thanks to all of you who are joining us. It just occurred to me, I almost wore that same outfit, sort of forgetting that the picture was. So I'm glad that you realize I have more than one outfit to wear.
Well, speaking of outfits, you are wearing something especially fitting for tonight's program. Can you share with the audience?
I certainly can. I discovered this button at a very important historical site that is also connected to and collaborates with Gilder Lehrman, and that is called the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas, Texas, in Dealey Plaza. And I was there for the Presidential Site Summit, sponsored by the White House Historical Association, on whose board I now proudly serve. And they had a summit there 2 years ago, and there will have another one coming up in Washington toward the end of September. But it really caught my eye because I remember seeing John F. Kennedy at that time when my mother took me to see him in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, where I was born and raised. And so it struck me there, and I just thought it would be particularly appropriate. And we'll actually get to a slide about its message as we go through this evening.
And can you read what the button says for those that may not be?
Sure. It says, if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. And the reason for that is, as I say, we'll explain a little bit more, is that some states did have an 18-year-old vote in 1960, and most did not. And so we'll talk about how that became an issue and about how a youngster even wrote to Senator Kennedy in 1957. And Gilder Lehrman has the letter that Senator Kennedy wrote back to the young person, and we'll test to see what you think about 18 versus 21 versus sometimes now people say, well, why not 16?
Well, thank you, Barbara. We are thrilled to have you with us this evening. Also joining us is Daniel Pecoraro. Daniel is a senior program manager here at GLI, and we are happy to have him on board talking about the Annenberg Project. But before we get to that, Daniel, welcome.
Great to be here, and always great to be with Professor Perry and with this great panel and be back on ITV to talk about voting rights history.
And certainly, last but not least, people who have been watching Inside the Vault for a long time probably are very familiar with Zoya Siddiqui, but we are very happy to have her on tonight's program, not only helping us with the program, but talking about voting rights as well. Zoya is one of our fantastic interns here at GLI and is a student at NYU. And Zoya also was a large contributor to the exhibition that we'll be discussing this evening. So Zoya, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. Allison knows how much I love Inside the Vault, and I've loved working on this exhibition, so I'm happy to be here.
All right, well, before we dive into tonight's documents, I will turn it over to Daniel, who will talk more about the Annenberg Project and a very exciting exhibition. Daniel.
Yeah, so as noted in my bio, lead on the project, The Right to Vote, the Role of States in the U.S. Constitution. This is supported by the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania through the Leonore Annenberg Institute for Civics Award, which is awarded to an organization within the Civics Renewal Network, group of about 40 nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations focused on civics in some capacity. Right to Vote is a new suite of resources and programming for high school students, their teachers, and the general public on the history of voting. Basically, the corner of voting and federalism. States primarily determine voting requirements, time, place, manner, and the Constitution. The right to vote is fundamental to a representative democracy. And this project shows the expansion and undulation of voting rights since the Constitution was ratified in 1789, and how people have fought to gain and keep the right to vote, while others have fought to limit its extension. So what does this consist of? This is a whole resource suite at gilderlehrman.org/right-to-vote. There are essays by 3 different scholars: Lisa Tatro at Carnegie Mellon University, Michael Pitts, who's at Indiana University, and Carrie Lee Merritt, who's an independent scholar. A new lesson plan in our Teaching Civics Through History curriculum. 6 states, 6 taking a stand, 6 states, 6 stories, 1 goal. Oof. Long lesson plan title. It's a series of about a dozen or so modules and lessons that can be used in a modular format or in a sequential format. And of course, our exhibition, which is in a digital format, along with our 7-panel exhibition, Who Can Vote? A Brief History of Voting Rights in the U.S. This exhibition is currently on the road at 6 different sites currently. It's in our 2nd display window, and we'll be continuing to tour it. You can apply at gilderlehrman.org/whocanvote-app. More on this later as well, in terms of which windows are particularly for at this point. And we're also hosting on September 15th our Voting Rights Forum. You can sign up at gilderlehrman.org/voting rights live stream to learn more and sign up for this program with an illustrious array of scholars, which will be taking place on September 15th, the Friday before Constitution Day, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, live from New York at Stuyvesant High School, and live streamed via Zoom across the country and around the world. And I'll throw things over to Allison to get us started talking about today's documents.
Thanks so much, Dane. I really appreciate that overview. I know you have more to share with us in a little bit. So we are, again, really excited to share tonight's documents on 20th century voting rights. If you were with us for the program in May, you got the first half of this exhibition talking about 18th and 19th century voting rights with Andy Robertson. So tonight is 20th century voting rights. The program follows the story of voting rights in America as presented in the exhibition. So we will jump right into the conversation talking about literacy tests. Barbara, what were literacy tests and what were they intended to do?
Literacy tests were given in different states around the country, sometimes to new immigrants, to those who had become citizens, but to try to indicate if they knew the English language and they were eligible to make an informed decision. But when we tend to talk about them for voting rights as relate to the 20th century and the latter part of the previous century, we typically are talking about those tests that were given, particularly in southern states, to try to block Black voters from voting. And there were a whole range of efforts to do that. Sadly, violence and physical attacks on Blacks who tried to vote. Only Black men at that time technically were allowed to vote via the 15th Amendment from 1869. And for a while, they were able to vote, and they had representation in their state legislatures and Congress. But there was a backlash, as people know, against that, particularly as the Jim Crow era developed. And these literacy tests were given out sometimes only to Blacks. And one of the ways to do that was to say, if you had a descendant, if you were a descendant of someone who could vote prior to 1867, then you didn't have to take a literacy test. Well, that became known as the grandfather test or the grandfather clause. And that was able to bypass, then white people didn't have to take the literacy test. So you just had all these double, triple, quadruple whammies, either physical violence, all of these together, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, trying to prevent the Black vote from even turning out, much less having their votes counted. And I was just watching, again, the movie, we may talk a little bit more about this as we go along tonight, that was put out, I think, in 2015 called Selma, about the voting rights marches in Selma in 1965. And if you've seen it, or if you go back and take a look at it, maybe on streaming, Oprah Winfrey was one of the producers, and she appears in the movie. And in the movie, she goes to a registrar in Mississippi and attempts as a Black woman to vote prior to the Voting Rights Act of 65, but presumably in the early 60s. And you see her writing out her name, and she writes down her race, and she goes up to this really nasty registrar, and she says, well, I filled it out correctly this time. So in other words, she's back again. And he says, oh, well, I'll decide if you filled it out correctly. And then he begins to question her in her literacy test. And the first question is, state the preamble of the US Constitution. And then just, in a really derogatory tone, he looks at her and says, do you know what a preamble is? She says yes. And then she proceeds to word for word read out from her own memory the preamble of the Constitution. So then he says, how many county judges are there in Mississippi or in Alabama? And she says, and you think, oh gosh, I wouldn't know that answer in a state. So how is she going to get this right? Well, clearly she's ready. So she says 67. And he says, name them. So with that, she has to turn around and she knows she's not going to get registered. So just one of the many ways that states use to disenfranchise Black Americans from the ballot box.
And were all of the questions that were asked in these literacy tests, were they all fact-based, or were some of them opinion-based that gave more of a chance for things to be deemed incorrect?
Well, if you look at even the questions here, they do seem to call for some judgment and opinions, but even as this example illustrated of the white registrar saying to the Black woman, I'll decide, in essence, I'll decide what the answer is, or if you've done this correctly. So one of them would be, people always use this example, instead of making it historical or constitution based, one kind of question was, how many bubbles on a bar of soap? Or you could say the philosophical, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? So a lot, it didn't matter, with some exceptions. And I use the example of two Black brothers. I've mentioned this to Allison before, but two Black brothers from Louisiana who were of the greatest generation. They both grew up to become constitutional law scholars and PhDs in political science. One was called Lucius Barker and one was called Twiley Barker. And they were still active when I was coming along in graduate school in the 1980s. And Lucius Barker taught at Washington University in St. Louis, and one of my friends had gotten his degree there. So I got to hear a lot about him. Professor Barker became the head of the American Political Science Association. He wrote many books on civil rights and liberties and the Black political experience. And here these two men who were clearly on their way to great things in the world of political science and history, when they go in to register in Louisiana as young men before the 1965 Voting Rights Act, they're asked about the Constitution. And of course, they ace it. And I'm not sure I ever found out if the registrar was so stunned that he or she let them go ahead and register, or even if they got the answers right, they were turned away with that, well, we'll determine what's right. I do want to point out, presumably this particular questionnaire was put together by the registrar, who either was not very literate himself or herself, or didn't proofread very well. So notice below the register, state of Mississippi, do not carry, blah, blah, blah. If you have registered, then keep going down. Yo, do not have to register anymore. So someone left the you out in typing on you. So yo, do not have to register anymore. And even that sounded awkward to me, the anymore. If you were really fluent in the English language, you would say, you don't have to register again. So I think the person who put this together was not necessarily a Shakespeare scholar, but there we have it.
It's the irony of the test itself, I suppose.
Right.
So in thinking about literacy tests, Thurgood Marshall comes into the conversation. What does Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall have to do with literacy tests?
Right. So we jump ahead a little bit to pick up his role in the civil rights. So everyone knows that I hope that he was the first African-American appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That was in 1967 by Lyndon Johnson, after he had been named in the early 60s by President Kennedy to be a federal judge. So he sat on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And then Johnson asked him to become Solicitor General, which is sort of the lead litigator, the top litigator in the Justice Department, kind of the third ranking person in the Justice Department. And it was from there that he becomes Supreme Court Justice. But most of you know him, of course, from Brown versus the Board of Education, but he argued a total of 32 cases before the US Supreme Court before he became a justice, and he won 29 of them. So wow. I also think of him as the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of Black rights, because sometimes people call her the Thurgood Marshall of women's rights and gender equality, which she is. And so they both share that pioneer role, one for Black and racial and ethnic equality, and one for gender equality. But the reason we bring him up now is that he joins the NAACP as a lawyer and a litigator in the 1930s. The NAACP had come on the scene and was established in 1908, particularly as a response to all of these efforts to disenfranchise Blacks and to really deny them, particularly males at that time, Black males, the rights given to them in the 15th Amendment. And women hadn't been given the right to vote, Black or white, in 1908. So Black intellectuals, joined by fellow travelers among white people, decided that they would band together and try to move forward to get the vote, to get the franchise in reality for Black men, and perhaps for Black women, and eventually for all women. And Thurgood Marshall joins in this effort when he joins the NAACP in, as I say, the early 1930s. And then by the time he becomes famous in this role, he is leading what is called the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And it is in that role that he also helps to expand Black voting rights by helping to get the Supreme Court, via another case that he won, Smith versus Allwright, to strike down what were called white primaries. As it became clear that eventually Blacks would probably be allowed to vote, the solidly Democratic South, big D, Democratic Party South, at that time, yes, the Democratic Party was the dominant party of the South. People can't believe that now, who didn't live at that time, because they know it's dominated now by the Republican Party. But I always say to students, now think back, would white people in the South before the changeover in the Nixon era of 1968 and beyond, would pre or post-Civil War whites in the South be for the party of Lincoln? So that sort of helps them click into, oh yeah, okay, they wouldn't be Republicans. Blacks were Republicans and the whites were Democrats. So what Democrats did as a further way of insulating the Black possible vote was to declare that their party, the Democratic Party, was a private entity and did not admit Blacks, much as a private club did not admit Blacks at that time, and to try to preserve them from having the federal government require parties and primaries to include Blacks. So thank goodness for Thurgood Marshall took up that cause as part of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and won that case in the 1940s before the U.S. Supreme Court. That basically the court said, sorry, we don't accept that argument. If you have a primary, you should allow all people to participate. Now, it may be closed if you live in a state, as I do now in Virginia, and grew up in Kentucky, has closed primaries. By that, we mean you must be registered in that party in order to vote. Let me take that back. Actually, in Kentucky, it's closed. In Virginia, it's now open, so that you can vote in whatever primary you wish, no matter, you don't even have to register as a party. But Kentucky is still closed, and you might be in a closed. But that's different. You know, it's okay to say we only want members of the party, but you can't prevent people based on race.
Well, he certainly was an important part, to say the least, of this movement. Zoya has a question from the audience.
Oh,
Zoya.
Yes, my question is, Dr. Perry, when we were initially drafting this exhibition, one of the things we talked about a lot was the relationship between the state and federal government as it relates to voting rights. And I think these first two documents are a perfect way to talk about that. How do you think literacy tests and then the Supreme Court play into this dynamic that we see over and over again between the federal and state governments in relation to suffrage?
Yes, a lot of people, I think, first of all, maybe a lot of people don't even really understand the principle of federalism, but we like to say to our students in civics that we have 51 governments in this country. We have 50 state governments and we have one federal government. Of course, we have local governments as well, so we could add that to the mix. But when it comes to voting rights, there is a clause in the US Constitution that lets states determine what is called the time, place, and manner of elections. And that's why states have had the opportunities to set different standards for voting, different ages for voting. Some states allowed women to vote earlier than others. Some states allowed Black people to vote earlier than others. Indigenous people were given the right to vote in the 20th century at different times in different states in which they live. So the concept of federalism, of having one central government, and remember, we've had two other kinds of constitutions where that wasn't the case. I always point out we've had two confederacies. The Articles of Confederation, our first constitution, as we went independent from England in 1776 and had to fight a revolution to maintain that independence, gain it, and maintain it. So that wasn't working. Remember when the founders met in 1787 in Philadelphia to write what turned out a whole new constitution and a whole new form of government, one that put more power in the hands of the national central government, but also to compromise allowed states and localities to have governments too, and to have a share of the power. So that's where we get these, sometimes states being in cross purposes, and sometimes people at the federal government level thinking, why isn't this uniform? You know, why didn't we have a uniform set of guidelines for who could vote in national elections? And I, for one, actually would like to see that. And I would say maybe the term, I get time and place. Manner seems to be a really broad term. And I might make the argument that if we're going to have uniformity and uniformity of basic rights like voting, should we not have the same universal suffrage across the board? And thank goodness, basically now we do. One element that comes up that's different from state to state right now is felons. If you have a record as a felon, have you had your vote, your suffrage taken away? In some states it's been given back, in some states not.
Well, thank you. That was a really great answer to a fantastic question. But let's jump back a little bit in the story of voting rights to women's suffrage. On the next slide here, we have this map with the title, The Awakening. Can you talk about what's happening in the image, and also what is the awakening?
Right. Well, as you can imagine, this has special resonance for me. I knew both of my grandmothers, my maternal grandmother and my paternal grandmother. And when both of them were born, they would not have had the right to vote. In some states, some they might have, but not as a national right. And my mother was born the year that the amendment passed, allowing women's suffrage. So to think, and yes, I know I'm getting older, but just to think that I'm like the first generation in my family that's only known the right to women's suffrage. So by 1915, and this wasn't something that was brand new, that women woke up in 1915 and said, oh, we should really have the right to vote. Right. Some states allowed them the right to vote. New Jersey, for example, was a very early adopter of it, and then took it away. I can't believe it, but my own state of Kentucky had for a while I think it was as early as the 1830s, had allowed women to vote. Usually Kentucky is not so progressive, but I'm proud of that. And then in the 1840s, everyone I think knows about the Seneca Falls Convention and the women's rights movement. But they stepped aside a little bit to focus on abolition. And in the pre-Civil War period, that kind of took over some of the activism. But women didn't forget about it. And some of the more progressive Western states were allowing women to vote. But I love this cartoon because, first of all, Lady Liberty is so active in it with her flowing robes and the torch. And she's running towards the women in the part of the country on the east side of the country, the east half of the country, who don't have the right to vote. And it shows them reaching out to her. And so this, I think, is a really good rendition of what things were like. Again, a divided nation where if you lived in one state, you as a woman had the right to vote, but if you lived in another, you didn't. That just seems so unfair to me.
And it almost seems like with the way that she's marching so confidently, it's almost, liberty is coming.
Yes.
I'm on the way. And
Yes.
One of my favorite pieces in the collection is a suffrage map, and the title is "The Map Proves It." And we featured it. It's been, I think, 3 years now since our women's suffrage inside the vault on our website in the archive, by the way, where it is a map where someone has taken pieces of paper, and as suffrage is changing over time across the country, they are changing it to represent what the key says. So if suffrage is in that state, the state is shaded white. Partial suffrage is, it has lines across it. And so someone is changing on their map. We don't know who it belonged to, but it is a fantastic map. And I love the idea that someone or group of people were tracing that suffrage and tracing that progress. And I think
Yes.
that was...
Yes, because just imagine that the country cut out half of the population
Right.
from voting. And that I always would point out, especially when I taught at Sweetbriar College here in Virginia, still all women, an all women's college, liberal arts college. I would say to my female students, think how women were thought of. If in the United States, across the country, we didn't have the right to vote in all states until 1920, when Black men, in theory, were given the right to vote in 1869 through the 15th Amendment, and some of them had just been enslaved. And they should have, once they were freed, they should have been given the right to vote, of course. That's what the Civil War was being fought about in part. But to think that it took 50 more years for women to rise up to that level.
Right. Well, something that we're often sent around were facsimile ballots, a way to teach people how to vote, or even to say this is what you should vote for. So our next slide is an image of such a facsimile ballot. Can you talk about what this is and what it's telling us?
Sure. Well, these are still put out, and I rely on them not so much because I need somebody to tell me how to vote, but they're occasionally I might. But there are, I would say, sort of two forms of these. So one is a ballot that would show you the candidates on a ballot. But states, unlike the federal government, and that's not the amendment process at the federal government level. That is spelled out in Amendment 5 of the Constitution, with either a constitutional convention proposing a constitutional amendment or the Congress. And if it passes both of those entities, one or the other, to get the process started, then it has to go to the states, and supermajority of states would have to pass it to approve it. In other states, they have a constitutional amendment referenda, so that they put that on the ballot. So this is an example of one of those. So when you go to the polls, you might get two forms of a sample ballot. Again, one would be with candidates, showing you what the candidates are. Another one would be if you have any kinds of propositions or any kinds of state amendments for which you would vote. And this one is included as we're talking about women's suffrage, because you'll notice not where the arrow is pointing, but go one down. Article 5, Section 2, extend to women the right of suffrage. So that would have been in a state. I think these are really helpful when they are neutral. When you have the government offering these to people that doesn't have an X and it doesn't say vote this way, but interest groups will come. I have just recently noticed here in Virginia, interest groups will come and say, I have an interest in this. And so here's a sample ballot showing you how our interest group would like you to vote. I always say, thank you very much. I have my own ideas. But also as a high schooler, I used to participate civically by working for candidates. And I would go hand out sample ballots for my candidate that would show my candidate with an X by his or her name. But there was a law in Kentucky that we had to stand, I think it was 50 feet away from the polling place, because they didn't want people to be inundated with all this paper and people trying to, twist their arms. So I was always very careful and polite to follow the rules and the laws. That's actually, by the way, the first time I met Mitch McConnell, that he was an up and coming Republican Politico. And I was handing out literature for a judge. If you can imagine, in Kentucky, judges, I think, still are picked on partisan ballots. And so if the truth is be known, I had a crush on the boy whose father was running, and the boy was in my French class. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll offer to hand out sample ballots for this boy's father, Judge Oldham. And so it so happened that Mitch McConnell was also supporting this man and came along to the polls to make sure I was doing my job.
There you go. Your career had to start somewhere, Barbara.
I started at the bottom.
Well, I think some people may find it surprising to learn that just as there were lots of campaigns in favor of women's suffrage, there were also campaigns that were not in favor of women's suffrage. You talk about these two opposing viewpoints, and clearly, one of the viewpoints, I guess you could say won. We're happy about that. I'm happy that I have the right to vote. But why did people not want women to vote? And why did women not want women to vote?
I know. And today we say, oh, things are so polarized, and bring back the good old days when we all agreed on things like women's suffrage. But no, we are always split, it seems, as human beings, and certainly in this country, and that's okay. And we have First Amendment freedom of speech rights to make our views known. So there were certainly men who didn't want women to vote because they didn't want women to have an impact on elections. There were men who said women were too busy to vote. They had to take care, they had to have children, they had to raise children, they had to take care of their households. They weren't even allowing for the fact that many women, of course, had to work outside the home to raise money for the family. But anyway, they just said women are too busy. And some said they were not mentally capable of making rational decisions. And then some said they'll just cancel out men's votes. So that's part of the reason men didn't want it. But if you can imagine, and as you said, there were some women who didn't want women to vote. And one who wasn't active in opposition and didn't join the opposition organization, but was a young Eleanor Roosevelt. And she writes in her own memoir that, it's sort of embarrassing to look back, but that she had 6 children within 10 or 11 years, one of whom died very young of pneumonia, I think it was, or flu. And she just had a very busy life, despite the fact that she had means and she had nursemaids and everything. But still, she just said even though her uncle was Teddy Roosevelt and had been president of the United States, she just was not as interested as she said she should have been. And she was already interested in social causes, working in settlement houses, but she just admits that it wasn't top of her agenda. And so it wasn't that she was terribly against it, but she just didn't work. She wasn't a suffragette, and she didn't work for it. And it just took her a while once women got the vote nationally to vote in 1920. And that's when her husband was on the ballot as vice presidential candidate.
Well, there is a woman part of the conversation of women's suffrage who I certainly hadn't heard before learning more about her thanks to this exhibition. Mary Church Terrell. Who was she? And if you would like to read this quote, I would love for you to. But what was her role in the movement?
Yeah, so she writes in A Colored Woman in a White World, and we should say today that you will see oftentimes in older eras, the reference to colored people or colored men or colored women, that's fallen out of use and favor. Labels for people change. We now say Indigenous peoples. So people of color is okay now, but she was referring to, she said, a white woman, and in her mind, as she said, only had one handicap to overcome, and it sure was a handicap, sex or gender, as we would now say. Again, we tend to not use the term sex, but rather gender. And she said, but I have two. I have both gender against me and race. And she was absolutely right. Low level on the totem pole. And maybe that's not properly used now. Low level on the ladder would be Black women. So she said, I belong to the only group in this country that has two huge obstacles to surmount. Colored men only have one, that of race. But like you, Allison, I didn't have a lot of knowledge about her. So I was really glad to look up more about her, and also just what a stunningly attractive person she was, and found out that she was one of the first American Black women to earn a university degree at Oberlin in Ohio. And she then went on to earn a master's degree. She taught Latin, and she ended up she traveled and studied in Europe for 2 years. She ended up being able to speak German and French and Spanish. And so she was multilingual, and she worked really hard for the rights of Black women, particularly Black women, to vote.
Well, the 19th Amendment, began to pave the way for equal voting rights for all women in the United States. Can you talk about the amendment here on the next slide and just what it says?
Right. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So finally, women, at least in theory, get that parity with men who have, from our founding, had the right to vote. As we know, looking back at the founding, it was still typically, again, state by state, but typically white males with property were allowed to vote. That opened up in the 1830s to allow white men without property to vote. Then you get, again, in theory, Black men allowed to vote by virtue of the 15th Amendment, and then finally women brought into the mix in 1919. So that's by joint resolution of Congress. Then that amendment has to go to the states, and then it is approved by the supermajority of states in 1920. And it's a turning point for women and for moving us towards universal suffrage. We should also note there's no mention of race here. So that means Black women of color are swept into the process.
There's a question from the audience from Zoya.
Yes, Dr. Perry, on that note, we have two questions that go together. The first is from Molly, who asks, can you touch on what it might have looked like to be a Black woman watching the 19th Amendment pass? Would they have considered it a celebration at the time, or did they know it actively wouldn't grant them the right to vote? And then similarly from Victoria, we have, why were Black women restricted from the white suffrage movement to begin with?
So yeah, I think, yes, I think, but the fact that it didn't say, it didn't indicate that only white women would be granted the vote. So there had to be celebration for Black women. And remember that not all Black women were excluded by states by virtue of violence or literacy tests or poll taxes. So in other words, there were Black women all over the country, some already being allowed to vote in some of the Western states. And now that women were allowed to vote across the country, again, I always say in theory, because we don't know that we know for a fact that in the South, they were not being allowed to vote. And that the number kept dropping from where it had been as a high for Black men right after the Civil War, right after emancipation, right after the 15th Amendment. Once Jim Crow kicks in and the backlash happens. So as Mary Church Terrell said, we're even lower than those Black men in terms of how white men view us. Look, imagine how white men in the South viewed Black women. And that anecdote that I gave of Oprah Winfrey playing the role of the Black woman going in to register, and probably in the early 60s, gives you a sense of how they were being treated by registrars. So I'm not sure it was so much a matter of being excluded from the suffrage movement by white women, but rather that we've always had these divisions, and we think of suffragists and their leadership tended to be white, but there were certainly Black women who were involved in moving that forward, thank goodness, in leadership as well.
And if I can chime in, one of the great pieces
Absolutely.
About digital exhibition accompanying the panel exhibitions, we have some interactive maps, including those showing at key moments in changes to the right to vote, how the electorate changes from one presidential election to another. From 1916 to 1920, there's a 44% increase in voter turnout, largely because of the 19th Amendment. But if you look at the map, it's primarily in states in the North. And that's a factor of, among other things, the early phases of the Great Migration and continued Jim Crow laws in the South preventing Black voters, regardless of gender, to vote.
That's so true. Thank you, Daniel.
There are a few questions from the audience about when Native Americans got the right to vote, which brings us perfectly into our next slide. Can you speak, Barbara, to about the Snyder Act and what that meant for Native Americans in this country?
Right. Well, the Snyder Act of 1924 granted citizenship to more than 100,000 Indigenous Americans. And you can see the breakdown of the population of the states that had the largest numbers of Indigenous people where they were located. And I think most people know the history of Indigenous people in this country. The fact that you had many Cherokee in the Georgia area, but that they were pushed out and forcibly pushed into the Oklahoma region. So you see some states that where they're absent and conspicuously absent because they've been moved out. We know that they had been killed. We know that there had been, and we hear a lot about this of late, particularly since we now have the first Native American woman to lead up the Interior Department, and she's working really hard on reconciliation involving assimilation policies, so that you had forcible removal of Native American children from their families and their tribes. But at least this 1924 act granted citizenship. Now, did that immediately grant the vote? I am sorry to say that it did not. It was still left up to states, as in this time, place, and manner element, to determine when and if they would grant Native Americans in their states the right to vote. And as it turned out, it took another 40 years for all states to grant that right and that privilege to Indigenous people. So another, I'm sorry to say, sad tale, but that notion that the arc of justice and the arc of history are we hoping bending towards justice? The good news here, and I know there's even conflict now about how to tell these stories in classrooms and how should we think of our country. And I have to tell you, I'm one of the most patriotic, pro-American people you'll ever find, and always have my flag out on the national holidays. And my brother's a Vietnam veteran. My dad was a World War II veteran. I'm very pro-military. But, we're not perfect. Our country is not perfect. And yet we are strong enough to deal with the times that we fell short of perfection. And yet the Constitution says in order to form a more perfect union. So we're always striving. I hope, I don't think humans ever attain perfection, but this is a story that, again, is behind Blacks and behind women, but at least it has moved forward as well.
Well, speaking of moving forward in time, we start talking about literacy tests as a way to prevent African Americans from voting. We flash forward to 1965, and there are still protests. Why are protests still needed? Why hasn't the vote been obtained by this point?
Right, because there's still no way to stop particularly the southern states and the former states of the Confederacy from administering these literacy tests, or just making it really hard to register, or just being arbitrary and capricious on the part of registrars in these southern towns and cities, but also, again, physical violence being used against Blacks and whites who support them. So you might know about the summer of 64, the summer of the fires of Mississippi, the three civil rights workers, one Black and two whites from the North, who were murdered in Mississippi for simply being there to try to help Black people register. And so by 1965, the boiling point had been reached. And there were 3 marches in that spring or late winter March of 1965 in Selma, Alabama. And one of them was led by, you will see just to the left of the middle police officer here, you can see the back kind of cream color raincoat of John Lewis, and the back of his head where he's about to be pushed to the ground and beaten over the head with a billy stick in Selma, Alabama, as he and others tried to march from there to the capital of Montgomery to try to really request, vociferously, Alabama to give Blacks the right to vote. George Wallace, the governor, was having nothing of it, and clearly these members of the police force in Selma were having nothing of it. John Lewis almost lost his life that day. He suffered a fractured skull, but you know that he went on to serve many years in Congress until his death from cancer several years ago. And he continued to create what he called good trouble. But in addition to the local constabulary turning against the peaceful protesters, by the way, we should note that the right to peaceably assemble is also granted in the US Constitution. But they also called out, the sheriff of Selma and that county called out white townspeople to serve as vigilantes, and they were armed as well. So the good news is there were whites on the other side. So you see here, white people supporting the Black people who were protesting. And finally, the third march after this one, which was so horrendous. And you all must also remember that this is the height of the Cold War, where the United States is the leader of the free world. How free are you? And how good an example are you to countries in what we then call the third world, particularly Africa, South America, Central America, who are mostly brown and Black people? And we're saying, join us, don't join the communists, don't go with the Soviet Union, don't go with the red Chinese, join the democracies, join the free people. And so President Kennedy knew this, President Johnson knew this. First of all, it's wrong not to allow universal suffrage, but it's really wrong not to allow people to protest that they don't have it if they are maintaining peacefulness, which they were. So by the time the final march occurs a few weeks later, led by Dr. King, people come from all over the country, Blacks and whites, particularly, people of the cloth, religious people, nuns, priests, rabbis, Greek Orthodox, Protestant ministers. Obviously, Dr. King is one of those. And so there's a religious component to it as well. And thank goodness by the summer of 1965, Johnson gets through the Congress, the Voting Rights Act of that year, and signs it into law. And here we are.
And here we are. You beat me to it, Barbara.
All right.
So, but what did this Voting Rights Act achieve? But also, was anybody left out of the Voting Rights Act?
So the Voting Rights Act tries to, and by and large succeeds. And Daniel might have statistics on this. Feel free to jump in if you do, and if not, just look up the difference between Black people being able to vote and voting after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It puts statutory legal teeth into the constitutional amendments of 15 and 19, allowing and providing for the Black vote and the women's vote. Yes, probably some Indigenous people are still left out because that's done on a state by state basis. Mm-hmm. But given that one of our through lines tonight has been literacy tests, the 65 Voting Rights Act explicitly banned the use of literacy tests. Thank goodness. But again, one of the things that it did, and people may have heard about this in recent times, particularly since 2013, when the Supreme Court began to defang a bit of a number of the teeth that were in the 65 Voting Rights Act. One of the provisions of that act required that any state, but particularly the southern states that had been most run afouling of, if I may use the term, the 15th and the 19th Amendments, but particularly the 15th, it required what was called pre-clearance. So if states were going to change their voting laws or change how to register, or even change, as they do every 10 years, the districts, the congressional districts, and maybe even state legislative districts, they would have to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department to show that they weren't attempting to go backwards and try to deny Black people the vote. And that worked. And every few years, I think it was every maybe 10, 15 years, that part of, at least that part of the Voting Rights Act, maybe the whole Voting Rights Act, had to be re-upped, if you will, by the Congress. And in a bipartisan way, it was. That, in other words, there was bipartisan agreement. And if you will notice the people in this picture, on the far left, as you look at the picture, is Hubert Humphrey, who was, by this time, after a long career in the Senate from Minnesota, after having been the mayor of St. Paul, I believe, it was one of the Twin Cities, and having a master's degree in political science and teaching civil rights and liberties and being for civil rights and liberties early on in the Democratic Party as a Northern Midwesterner. He had a huge role in the 64 and the 65 acts in civil rights. But on the far right, no spectrum indicated here, but on the far right of the picture is Everett Dirksen, the leader of the Republican Party from Illinois. And so it was bipartisan, but it was also Lyndon Johnson using his arm twisting to get things through. But we've seen a little bit of a drawback on the part of the Supreme Court, with it being more conservative now, saying, for example, Chief Justice Roberts has said, well, we're such a long way from when these problems happened in the 1960s and before, that maybe we don't need this pre-clearance anymore. People can judge for themselves whether they think that's a good or bad decision. You might agree with it, you might disagree.
Daniel has joined us. Daniel, did you want to comment on that?
I did, on two fronts. So first of all, thank you, Professor Perry, and summoning me with some data.
Right.
So we had in the digital exhibition, we know that 250,000 Black voters registered after the new law was passed. I believe it was in the first couple of years, and you see that increase in the next 3 presidential elections, especially in the Sun Belt, where you have a massive increase in not just registration but in turnout. Part of that also has to do with the elimination of poll taxes as well. That was the 23rd Amendment, if I recall correctly. The 23rd or 24th?
Well, I got 24th.
24th, okay.
1964, yes. That had abolished the poll tax, which required people to pay a tax in order to vote.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, not necessarily the case, but a lot of time that was done in a way to limit the electorate, certainly on socioeconomic grounds, often on racial grounds as well. But the other thing I wanted to note was in terms of that renewing and reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. That it happened in 1970, 1975, 82, 92, 2006, all with bipartisan votes. So there has been sustained, historically sustained bipartisan support for the Voting Rights Act because of what it's done for the electorate more broadly.
Well, in the final minutes, Zoya has a question.
If we have time for it, we do have a quick question. I just wanted to circle back really quickly. You touched on it briefly, Dr. Perry, but what effect did Freedom Summer have on all of this? How did it impact voting rights? How did it lead to this act ultimately getting signed? What was the influence there?
Right. Well, people I'm sure know about the freedom rides of the early 1960s, where you had Black and white, particularly students, but older people as well, who boarded buses in the North and had them go down to the South in order to prove that Blacks and whites should be allowed by virtue of court decisions on public transportation. That also ginned up, again, white participation in the North, with people who said it's just so wrong that Black people in the South should not be allowed to vote. And so you had this influx of trained students, Blacks and whites, but a lot of white students coming from the North into Mississippi for the so-called Mississippi Freedom Summer. And you also had in 1964, then the Mississippi Freedom Party, led by Julian Bond, the late Julian Bond. And I was so privileged to not know him well, but see him speak here at the University of Virginia, where he was a professor, just an amazing speaker and such a learned man. And historian of civil rights, but he was leading, along with many others, this effort to get the Democratic Party to seat them as delegates at the presidential convention. So even though people now look at Lyndon Johnson and say, oh, great civil rights leader, and he was, but you have to remember that a huge chunk of his party was white in the South, most of whom were segregationists, many of them white supremacists, who didn't want Blacks to have equality, didn't want them to have the vote, didn't want them to be able to enter public facilities or public facilities that were privately owned, like hotels and restaurants and movie theaters and department stores and lunch counters. So Lyndon Johnson is one of those people, much like Harry Truman. I just came back from a symposium in Washington celebrating Harry Truman's 75th anniversary of his signing the executive order that desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces and required equality in hiring in the federal government. And he did this in 1948, despite everyone advising him, saying, you'll probably lose the election of 48. He didn't. In Lyndon Johnson's case, he supposedly said as he signed the Voting Rights Act, or at least thought out loud at another time, I'm probably signing away the Democratic Party in the South for many generations. If he did say that, he was absolutely right, because as you know, one of the responses in the South was for white Southerners to leave the Democratic Party and go to the Republican Party, which is why the Republicans now control the South. And it is a one-party state. It just switched parties.
Well, in the final bit of time, let's circle back to your button. There are students there are students in our audience tonight who may be surprised to learn that the legal voting age was once 21. And so what does then Senator John F. Kennedy have to say in response to someone who wrote about that very topic?
Yes, so someone wrote to him in 1957, and this is a wonderful letter that is signed by him and is in the archives of Gilder Lehrman. And it is to say that this young person believes that those who are younger than 21 should be allowed to vote perhaps from 18 onwards. And one of the reasons for thinking this was that because states could pick different times of different manners of voting. In my home state of Kentucky, for example, my brother was allowed to vote at age 18 in 1964. And he had just turned 18 and he was allowed to vote in the Lyndon Johnson Barry Goldwater election. Georgia allowed 18-year-olds the right to vote. That was the youngest age, and it still is, obviously. So thank goodness by this time, we now, as of the amendment in 1971, we now have the 18-year-old right to vote. But Kennedy said, no, I think this was as a senator. I think we should leave it up to the states. It's an irony because he was 43 when he was elected president in 1960, and he had a lot of young people who wanted him to vote. He should have been in favor of the 18-year-old vote, but it didn't come around till another 10 years later because of the draft. At that time, so many young men, including my brother, were being asked to serve their country because of the Vietnam War. And their view was, it says on this button, you fight and die, but you can't vote at 18. That was what really pushed members of Congress and states over the edge to say, yeah, let's give everybody 18 years old and older the vote. And this is a great topic for students now. Should we lower it again to 16?
It's definitely a good conversation or a good debate to have in a classroom. I do want to give a little bit of a plug. That button that you just mentioned there in the middle on the screen is currently on display from our collection at the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center in Washington, D.C. And it will be there for a few more years. So if you are in D.C., you're on the U.S. Capitol tour, you will see that button there on display. Do we have time for one more question, Barbara, before we conclude tonight's program?
Absolutely.
All right. Zoya, what do you have for us?
Hi. So yes, as a sort of question to round out the night, there are several similar questions from the audience that basically all ask the same thing. Dr. Perry, why do you feel that throughout history there's such a resistance to allowing the right to vote?
Just think of human nature, I would say. When people get into a group, and the founding fathers knew this, and if you've read your Federalist paper number 10 by James Madison, you will note his use of the term factions. And he says they are natural. They are just natural. People gather together based on their common interests. And then it's the case that when they band together for their common interests, they often want to hold power for themselves and that group and that interest. So name any interest group if you want currently, or any racial group or ethnic group or gender just name anything. And you will find a group of people who are huddled around it, who either want power because they don't have it, or they have power and they don't necessarily want to give it over. So, and let me end on a positive note though. That tends to be the selfish view of human nature. And we have to be honest about it. We can't pretend that, as Madison said in Federalist Paper 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We wouldn't even need government, and there wouldn't be a question of power because everybody would love each other and be good to each other. That is not, sadly, how humans are. But there are enough good people in the world, in the United States, to have expanded the role in our government and in our civic culture that basically now anyone 18 years old and over may have a say in how this country is run. And that came about because people of goodwill, and Bill Clinton always says, think about the world this way. Do you think there are more good people in the world or more bad people? I believe there are more good people in the world than bad people. And I certainly believe that in the United States. And that's why this is a history that has many sad stories, but the overarching arc of it is good. It also says, though, that these rights can disappear and we must hold on to them firmly. And we must be good to fight for those who might be losing their rights or not exercising their rights. And we must hold firm for them and carry on.
Those are fantastic words to conclude tonight's program, Barbara. Thank you so much. Before we finish the whole program out, I'll turn it back over to Daniel, who will give a couple of announcements about exhibitions. Daniel.
So yeah, first of all, we have the Who Can Vote exhibition, which I mentioned earlier. Kind of this program was the second of two bookend inside the vaults to highlight some of the pieces, some of the many pieces in these 7 panels, jam-packed, and including introductions co-written by Professor Perry herself. We're still looking for venues to host the exhibition: affiliate schools, library affiliates, historic sites, museums, courthouses, city halls, you name it. Especially looking for the November 27th to January 5th spot, because as you might imagine, not the best for schools because it's kind of smack dab within the holiday season. You can go to gilderlehrman.org/who-can-vote-app to apply by September 25th for that time slot. But we got time slots from basically at that point all the way out to June for you to apply for. In addition, we also have 2 professional development programs following the Voting Rights Forum on October 11th and October 14th. Same content, just at different dates and times. Professor Bertrand Ross, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, will be part of the panel for our forum, and Patience LeBlanc, who's the 2017 Texas History Teacher of the Year, will be on the program, also held on Zoom, discussing the history of voting rights and how to use material from our resource suite.
Thank you, Daniel. And to conclude our program slides, Zoya, what's upcoming at GLI?
So our next Inside the Vault session will be on September 7th at 7 p.m., where we'll be joined by Dr. Eliza Gould to discuss materials related to the Treaty of Paris. Our next book breaks is this Sunday on August 6th at 2 p.m., where Claire Rydell Arsenis will discuss her book, America's Philosopher John Locke in American Intellectual Life. And if you are interested in hearing more from Dr. Perry, then sign up for her course, The Kennedy Era, on offer during the fall 2023 semester of the Gettysburg Gilder Lehrman Masters in American History. Applications are online, and there should be a link in the chat.
Thank you, Zoya, for all of those fantastic upcoming events. Pardon me. Thank you all for being here this evening. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. It was a fantastic program. We are always happy to have you on Inside the Vault. For all of our audience.
And we want to thank Allison and Daniel and Zoya and Hannah and everyone at Gilder Lehrman who puts on these tremendous programs, and that they are such a repository of our history.
Oh, well, thank you so much. For those of you in attendance this evening and everybody who has signed up for the program, you'll be receiving this program recording, the slide deck that you saw, all of the links that were shared with you, and more resources from Gilder Lehrman in your email inbox tomorrow afternoon. So be on the lookout for that. If you are not getting our emails, we want to fix that. It may be possible that your server is blocking our email address. So try a different email and contact us at collectionprograms@gilderlehrman.org. It is always a pleasure to join you this first Thursday of the month, and we will see you again in September. Until then, take care.